Great, AP Psych, are you ready for this one? This is Unit 5, Lecture 5. It's all about forgetting. I hope you have removed all distractions and that you are focused and you are selecting to give me your attention so you can do some elaborate encoding, because this is going to be a lot. It's going to be a lot. Here we go. It's just one learning target. Describe strategies for memory improvement and typical memory errors. In other words, why do we forget? And the answer is lots of reasons. Okay, so forgetting is the inability to retrieve information, so like get it back out of your memory, due to poor encoding, storage, or retrieval. We are going to break down the fact that it can, stay with me here, it can occur at any stage. Forgetting can happen because of a problem encoding, because of a failure to store properly, or because of a failure to retrieve it properly. Okay, so that's going to be important. There's lots of reasons for forgetting. We need to understand all of them. And most importantly, in these first couple slides, we need to pay attention to what is failing within the memory to make encoding not work, storage not work, or retrieval not work. Okay. And this diagram kind of helps us understand it. And I realize that my big old face is blocking this first circle, but we sense a ton of stuff, an infinite amount of stuff. And then our working memory kind of notices and pays attention to a few of those things. And then only a few of those things actually make it all the way to long-term storage. But then even fewer are remembered completely accurately, if at all. And that's what really we're focusing on today. So the first type of failure is encoding failure. When we look back at our encoding notes, now these are just examples of encoding failure, but if we look back at our encoding notes, specifically at the memory effects, we can sort of identify what's going wrong with the encoding. With next in line effect, when you're perhaps waiting for your turn to say something, you're failing to include what happened right before you talk because you were too busy putting your attention on what you were about to say instead of bringing in the information that came right before your turn to talk. Spacing effect, if we cram it all in, if we cram it all in, we're not actually paying attention to each bit of information or repeating it over and over. We're trying to just learn everything at once, and it's almost so overwhelming, or we learn everything at such a shallow level, nothing really gets encoded properly. And with serial position effect, we are paying a great deal of information to the beginning of a memory and at the end, but we are failing to encode the middle properly because we have given so much extra attention to the beginning and the end of either a memory, a list, a set of information, that sort of thing. So that's how each are encoding failures. Ultimately, you can't encode what you don't notice, sense, or rehearse. If you're not paying attention to it, or you're not practicing it, or your senses don't pick up on it, it can't get encoded. Okay? Selective attention is the reason for most of these failures. Forgetting can also happen because of storage decay. So this is the next phase of the memory process. So let's say you learn a bunch of stuff. And heck, let's even say you get it encoded and stored into your memory. What happens, what research has shown us, is that after learning, there's an initial drop in retention. However, it does even out over time. So this has been discovered by a psychologist named Ebbinghaus, and he developed a forgetting curve. And I'm going to be probably going to my notes a lot during this lecture because there's a bunch of research that backs all this stuff up that I want to make sure we're covering. So Ebbinghaus did a study with a bunch of nonsense words, like syllables that don't actually make up real words with meaning. And he had participants learn these nonsense words and then do something else, distract themselves, and then try to repeat them back. And what he found was that over time, when people could repeat them back quite well at the beginning, but then over the course of days, if they weren't retaught, that memory would fade and fade and fade and fade. However, if another participant was then reviewed those nonsense words, they would retain a little bit more, that would fade. If they learned it again, they would retain a little bit more, though that would fade. And if they reviewed it again, they would actually maintain the most amount of information. So in Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, it kind of demonstrates that our memory is very, very strong when we first learn something, but then it tends to fade away. However, if we review it, rehearse it, relearn it, we lose a little bit less each time. So our memory trace gets stronger and stronger. When we don't use it, memories gradually fade because the memory trace, that memory trace or synaptic path that you're trying to build up by learning something and repeating it over and over, if you don't do that, it will start to fade. And that memory path in your brain is not as strong. And I'd like to add that these memories tend to, especially if they've been rehearsed, these memories tend to fade when they're not used, but they don't delete. They don't disappear entirely. Another psychologist, Barrick, he actually repeated similar research, but he did it over the course of months and years as opposed to Ebbinghaus, who just did it over a course of 30 days. And what he found, he studied people who had studied Spanish over high school, over their years of high school. So these are people that did learn something over and over and over again. But what he found was when they stopped using it, within 3 years, they could remember very little of their Spanish training, but not nothing. So they still retain some things here and there. But again, just like we've said before in this unit, you don't use it, you lose it in terms of memory. And speaking of, I forgot that I put this arrow in here. So think about what will happen with what you are learning right now, especially if you don't rehearse it or study it or review it. It's going to fade. And this will be good for nothing. Good thing it's recorded. You can watch this again and relearn it. Okay, the next big reason why we forget things is retrieval failure. In a way, that's what forgetting is. You've got the information in there, you just can't retrieve it. You just can't get it out. So the information is in memory, but it can't be accessed. The main reason this happens is something called interference. So yeah, I've got this little clip. We're not actually going to watch the clip of pass interference in football. In other words, something is blocking. That's just meant as a metaphor. Something is blocking your ability to get information out of your brain. We're also going to cover amnesia in the second half of this lecture, but both of these are really, really big concepts, and they amount to some of the most confused vocabulary terms in the entire course. So again, refresh, selective attention, get focused on what we're doing so you can really follow along here. Okay, the first type of interference. We have 2 types of interference and 2 types of amnesia. The first type of interference is proactive interference. What this means is old information is blocking the retrieval of new information. The reason I have interferes with and then crossed out is, yes, that does mean the same thing, but if we're explaining this on an FRQ in our writing, we cannot use the word interfere. We have to describe it differently to prove that we understand what it means. So think of when old information blocks the retrieval of new information. For example, when you're writing out the date, the year specifically in January, you might still write the previous year. That old information, you're so used to it, you're so comfortable with it, that you're not even really able to bring forth the new information. Maybe you moved, but you still seem to give out your old address. Old is blocking the new information. You buy a new lock, or you get a new locker at school and you still want to use the old combination or go to the old locker. Passwords are a big one. If you have to change your password for your email or some other thing, and you want to put in the old stuff instead of the new. All of those are proactive interference. Basically, the old stuff you've learned before is getting in the way of you remembering the new stuff right now. Retroactive interference is exactly the opposite. It is when new information blocks the retrieval of old information. So think of it this way. You are currently in pre-calc or calculus, something like that. Let's just say you are. And you can't remember how to solve the most basic geometry question when a sophomore in your TAC asks you for help. You know you passed that class, you know you should be able to help them, but you've got so much calc knowledge or pre-calc knowledge or whatever in your brain, you can't access that old stuff. Let's say you learn new lyrics to a song. So when you're thinking of Jingle Bells, you're so used to singing Jingle Bells, Batman smells, Robin laid an egg, that you can't even remember how the original Jingle Bells goes. Or when I teach you more and more stuff, and then we have a cumulative exam, you're pretty good at remembering the more recent units, but not those first ones. That's because all the new information is blocking the old information. Heck, even with me and learning names, I now know we are far enough into the school year. I probably know most of your names better than the students from last year. Whereas at the beginning of the year, I might have had proactive interference where I kept wanting to say the names of my old students because I couldn't remember my new students' names. But with time and practice and rehearsal, it starts to shift. There's actually a study tip involved with this concept as well. Studies show that sleeping immediately after studying can aid your retention of whatever it was you were studying, because if you study right before you go to bed, all of that information is fresh, and then you go or freshly reviewed or freshly rehearsed. When you go to bed, there's no new information that you need to process that could produce retroactive interference. So it's actually not a bad study tip to study something and go right to bed without thinking about anything else. And try it next time and see how it does, or how it works for you, how it works for you. Inevitably, a lecture on forgetting will lead to the concept of repression. And repression is a type of motivated forgetting, where perhaps there's things that in our consciousness we don't want to remember, we don't want to recall. This is called repression. So it's a defense mechanism that banishes anxious thoughts, feelings, and memories from consciousness. This is actually a term by a guy named Sigmund Freud. And he theorized that we do that to protect ourselves. However, there's other psychologists that would argue the point and say, no, trauma actually makes you recall even more vivid memories. We'll get more into this when we get more into Freud and defense mechanisms in our personality unit. But for the moment, is there such thing as repression? Some psychologists think so. Some psychologists don't think so. So let's summarize before we move on and before you turn your page. Let's summarize, why do we forget? We forget because there could be an error at any stage in memory. We could filter, alter, or lose information during each stage, going from sensory memory to short-term, going from short-term to long-term, or retrieving from long-term. So in any of these places, we could not gain that information permanently into our long-term or not be able to access it out of our long-term memory. This is a great time to pause and regroup because we're going to shift into the next major cause of forgetting, and this continues to get a little bit more complicated. So shake it up, take a quick pause, and get ready to refocus. Okay, now to talk amnesia. Amnesia is the partial or complete memory loss due to physical or psychological damage. And that word damage is what sets it apart from regular old interference. A lot of us forget things all the time, and it's just because we have different types of interference going on. Here, it's because something happened to you. So either you have physical damage to your brain because of something like a disease, brain trauma, stroke, Alzheimer's, that sort of thing, or you've got damage psychologically, perhaps by a traumatic event. The one difference is that psychologists have determined that with psychological amnesia, for the most part, memories will return over time. And just like with interference, there are two types. The first one is anterograde, which is the inability to remember new events. So information that came after the amnesia damage occurred. That's what you can't remember. You can't remember the information that came after that damage. Retrograde is the inability to remember old events, or in other words, the past. You cannot remember information that came before the amnesia occurred. So you can remember the new stuff, and as people tell you, oh, your name is Johnny, you're like, okay, my name is Johnny. But your name could have been Jimmy before that. But you can't remember that. You're remembering what's new. We will do a lot of practice in class. And so this is tricky because You can certainly try to remember these based on what you remember, but I actually encourage you to remember these based on where is the memory loss. Is the loss for the memories before the trauma or after the trauma? Again, we'll practice this a great deal in class. Just get these down in your notes for now. And then why not? Let's throw in one more, and that is source amnesia. And this is a little deceiving because it's not really a result of damage. It's just when you attribute an event or an information to the wrong source. Like saying, I know you from somewhere. I must know you from AAU basketball. That's it. That's why I know you. And maybe that's not the case at all. Maybe it's someone who used to go to your school and they transferred. So you recognize someone, but you don't really know why, or maybe you think it's the wrong reason why. Or else going up to a friend and be like, guess what? I've got the biggest news. And then you drop what you think is going to be a juicy bomb on them. And it turns out that friend's like, no. I'm the one that told you that. Okay. So here's the thing. Source amnesia is not that hard to understand. It's just the word amnesia. For whatever reason, this is the term and it has nothing to do with damage. It's just tricky. So source amnesia, just forgetting where you heard something. Let's not make it more complicated than that. Let's do a quick experiment in this YouTube video. Which president was Alexander Hamilton? Was he the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 7th, or 8th? Write down your answer and stay tuned for more. Let's talk about true versus false memories. Just like some of the optical illusions we had, sometimes our brains are tricked into thinking something is true when they're really not. And just because a memory feels real doesn't mean it is real. Our memories continuously revise themselves as they're retrieved. So as we maybe try to describe them to someone else or just even bring them back to think about them, our brain will fill in gaps to make our recall make more sense, be more coherent or complete. So if you can remember this part of an event and that part of an event, you might unintentionally remember something in the middle that didn't really happen. Our brain doesn't like being confused. One of several reasons why we end up with these false memories is the misinformation effect. This is when you are incorporating, usually without doing it on purpose, you are incorporating misleading information into your memory of an event. So, for example, you might mix memories together incorrectly. Let's take a quick look at this little picture of this little girl. That's me. So cute. And I am at, yes, my brother's birthday party. As you can see, this is my brother about to blow out some candles. And for the longest time when I was shown this picture, I was convinced up and down that it was my birthday party. And I remember wearing that dress and whatnot. But the truth is that I liked that dress. I liked it a lot. It had Mickey Mouse all over it, and I wore it a lot. And so I took the memory of wearing that dress a lot and the memory of that picture at my brother's birthday party, and I thought it was my birthday party. Another very common way to create misinformation is the phrasing of a question. So Elizabeth Loftus, who is a researcher we're going to talk about on the next slide as well, she actually conducted a experiment with having two groups of people watch a car crash. And then she asked them questions about it. And one of the ways she asked them was, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? And then the other group, she asked, how fast were the cars going when they hit each other? The questions were a little bit different. A week later, when asked how much broken glass was on the ground, the group that heard the question, how fast were they going when they smashed into each other, were 2 times more likely to report seeing glass on the ground than the other group. And the truth is, there was no glass on the ground in the picture, in the video clip that they saw. So by phrasing of a certain question, you can almost lead someone to think that they remember something that they didn't. More on this later. So more on that later, but a little bit more on Elizabeth Loftus right now. One other research story. She actually contacted some parents of a bunch of her college students. She's a professor, and she asked them a bunch of true childhood details. And then she started having discussions with her college students about these childhood details, but then also added some likely but untrue events to their discussions. So, for example, she started saying, tell me about that time you were lost in the shopping mall. What was that like? Or tell me about the time you met Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. I want to hear about that. And then after several days of recalling these different events, when asked again, many students remembered events that weren't even true. Case in point, you cannot meet Bugs Bunny at Disneyland. Different sets of characters. What she did is she created false memories by having students repeatedly imagine or visualize something. And because of visualization and because of the rehearsal, it feels familiar, it feels true, and all of a sudden people had false memories of an event. Speaking of, what did you answer on the Try It from a few screens ago? Did you answer that Alexander Hamilton was never actually president? That would be the right answer. It was a trick question. Yes, he was one of our founding fathers, and he was involved in the early stages of our country, of the creation of our country's government, but he was never actually president. But because we study him in those terms, and because of my leading question, I might have tricked you into thinking that that was true. This leads me to the concept of eyewitness testimony, which we will also cover a little bit more in class or with an activity. And so piggybacking all of these different things that we've been learning about memory, we know that eyewitness testimony is actually quite full of errors due to the anxiety and stress that someone's usually under if they're being asked these questions, fading of memory over time, reconstructive memories, which is actually another term for false memories, and leading questions. So what we need to be thinking about when we think about the importance or the use of eyewitness testimony is all the different ways we've learned that remembering can be full of errors. Nonetheless, it is still one of the main methods used to gain information about crimes. And we have also discovered that people are less influenced by leading questions if they're warned of possible memory bias. So if they take a course like psychology or are told, be careful because certain questions might lead you to have a false memory, they are more able to check themselves and stay more true to their actual memories. Almost done. Thanks for sticking with me. Overall, let's think of all the different ways we've learned not just why memories can be false, but how memories can be better. Studying repeatedly, rehearsing or actively thinking about material, so elaborate encoding, making material personally meaningful with self-referencing effect, using mnemonic devices, activating retrieval cues by recreating our situation, our mood, our mental state that we're in when we do the encoding and learning in the first place, trying to recall events when they are fresh before you encounter misinformation or learn new information that creates interference. And ultimately, that's why we do practice quizzes and practice tests to figure out what you know and what you don't know and what memories are true and not true, which leads me to the final term in our memory unit. Holy moly, this was a long one. And that is metacognition. It is important to focus on knowing what you know and recognizing and admitting what you don't know. Understanding your own thought process, where your errors are in your thinking, where your errors are in your memory, and being real with yourself about it, which really leads us into the second half of this unit. But that's all we'll do for now. Great job, you hung in there.